Good evening, everybody, and welcome. In much of the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, the language of faith is saturated with the language of history. The God of Israel, whose proper name is Yahweh, makes his self-disclosure within narratives about the emergence of the nation of Israel within very complicated events of the ancient Middle East. The grammar of faith of the Hebrew Bible, then, includes not just words like covenant, righteousness, sin, and faithfulness, but also names like Egypt, Babylonia, Assyria, Persia, the Hittites. Nevertheless, there are not many points where our modern knowledge of that ancient world intersects exactly with specific references made in the Old Testament. Tonight I want to talk about one of those interesting places where modern discoveries do connect rather precisely with an important topic in the Bible. This centers on the founder of the Persian Empire, that fascinating man who called himself, and we call, Cyrus the Great. The occasion for this is a traveling exhibit of artifacts from the empire that Cyrus founded in the 500s BCE, whose centerpiece is an inscription that Cyrus had made on a cylinder-shaped text and buried as a foundation inscription, probably close to 539 BC. That would have functioned something like one of our cornerstones in a building. These items are normally housed in the British Museum in London. They have been traveling in North America for a while and will soon go on display in the Metropolitan Museum here in New York this coming Thursday, the 20th of June. Why so much interest in this little inscription that's hardly larger than an American football? Let's begin our story with the career of the person whose scribes wrote this little inscription, Cyrus. We've come to call him primarily Cyrus the Great, but technically speaking, his name was Cyrus II, because within the little kingdom where he started, he was not the first person named Cyrus. Only legends survive about his origins, but we can trace some of the main facts about his political career. Let's take just a minute to familiarize ourselves with this map of the world at the time of Cyrus's rise. The great political structure that loomed over everything else was the Empire of Babylonia that controlled virtually everything that we know loosely as the Fertile Crescent. Egypt still exists as a nation, but far weaker than it had been in earlier millennia. Cyrus's beginnings are over here in this little kingdom of Anshan. About 559, he inherited this kingdom here. He also seems to have had some kinship with the ruling family of Media up here in this area to the north. He was a very ambitious person politically. Within about 9 years, he had succeeded in conquering the kingdom of Media, giving himself now a very significant power base in the east from which to build his own expansion. Instead of moving directly against Babylonia, which was his ultimate goal, Cyrus seems to have campaigned up across the north, eventually taking the separate kingdom of Lydia and much of Asia Minor. It looks, from what we can deduce from some inscriptions, as if at that point he cut back east and campaigned all the way over to what is in later times India. With this huge political base now in place, he was ready to begin to tackle the kingdom of Babylon. Since the late 600s, Babylon, the city of Babylon here, had been the seat of an empire that controlled all of this region and dominated this entire world. The Babylonians in 604 had conquered the nation of Israel, more properly speaking, the country of Judah, which was all that was left of the old nation of Israel over here, so that it had become annexed into this big alien hegemony. No nation likes to be ruled by another one for obvious reasons. Political self-determination is lost. Heavy taxes have to be paid to the overlord. There are always local abuses by occupying troops and officials. But for Judah, there were also deep religious factors involved. Their very identity as a people was tied to the ancient promise of their God to Abraham to give them a permanent homeland. This had just been amplified when their nation had been turned into a formal monarchical nation state under David. Furthermore, the tradition gave David a special promise from God that his line would be on the Jerusalem throne forever. The very presence of their God Yahweh was thought to be connected uniquely to the Jerusalem temple. So in addition to the things that would afflict any conquered nation, for Judah to be subjugated by the Babylonians with their very different gods and goddesses was a terrible fate, and one which undermined their very identity. Despite the power of the Babylonian state, Jeremiah indicates that there was continual plotting in Jerusalem to devise a strategy for trying to throw off Babylonian rule. It may have been aided and abetted by some meddling with Egypt underneath the table. The Babylonian kings, of course, had no intention of letting this little district here in the southwest area of their borders break away. In 598-597, Babylonian troops moved into Judah in a disciplinary strike. The Babylonian Chronicle says that they confiscated a huge amount of valuable goods, including some things from the Jerusalem temple. They removed the sitting king and replaced him with a loyalist, and they deported several thousand people over to Babylon. This threatening move was not effective. Jerusalem continued to be a hothouse of sedition. And so finally, 10 years later in 587-586, Babylonian troops were back on Judahite soil, this time besieging and breaking down the city, killing thousands, destroying many of its buildings, including the entire Jerusalem temple, and deporting thousands more over here in the region of Nippur. All of this had happened about a half a century before Cyrus's rise. This meant that now that Cyrus began to threaten this Babylonian empire, it was a Babylonian he was threatening that ruled not only the old heartland of the Israelites, but he ruled also the thousands of Judahite deportees who were settled here in Mesopotamia. Now, the records show clearly that despite its size, the Babylonian Empire had been weakening internally apart from Cyrus. Its very last king, Nabonidus, had favored the moon god Sin instead of the traditional dominant god Marduk. Let's take a quick break and just have a look at a list of some of the major Babylonian gods. Marduk, the king of the gods and the patron of Babylon. Nabu or Nebo, the son of Marduk, the scribe of the gods. Enlil, the god of weather and wind and the god of the city of Nippur. And Sin, the moon god, the son of Enlil. These are the chief deities of the Babylonians. Marduk had been the predominant god, and his priesthood had been the predominant power in Babylonia, but the last king, Nabonidus, was inclined to the moon god Sin. Nabonidus also lived away from the capital city for a long period of time, weakening his influence and further impeding religious observances that required his participation. International trade was falling off, hurting the national economy. As a result, by the time Cyrus was poised on these borders, there was already a great deal of internal dissent in Babylonia and a lot of dissatisfaction with their king, Nabonidus. By the time that Cyrus was ready actually to attack Babylonia, there's every indication that the internal resistance to him was weak. There may have even been some active assistance given to the Persian troops from inside. In October 539, Cyrus was ready to move. He defeated a main contingent of the Babylonian army at the city of Opus. The famous old city of Akkad was destroyed and much of its population slaughtered. The Persian troops then marched into the city of Babylon itself under the leadership of the General Gobryas. Nabonidus had hurried back to Babylon for this defense and had ordered many statues of the various Babylonian gods to be brought to Babylon to sort of help defend it, but all too late. Cyrus captured Babylon with very little resistance, and he thus took over everything that had been the Babylonian Empire. So, as of 539, we can now speak of the Persian Empire that includes everything that had been Babylonia, plus the new eastern and northern lands that Cyrus himself had come to dominate. Egypt will be conquered later by his successor. This now brings us about to the time when the Cyrus Cylinder was written. Let's have no illusions. Cyrus was an aggressive military empire builder. He used his armies effectively, threatening force where he could, killing and destroying where he had to. But once in power, he pursued a philosophy of government that was different from the Assyrian and Babylonian empires before him. Sheer brutal suppression had been the policy of the Assyrians, copied a little less harshly by the Babylonians. They relied on fear by the subject peoples. Also, the policy of forcibly deporting the leadership classes from their native location shattered the institution and social groups of the subject peoples and eliminated those elements that could have organized rebellion. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians had as their stock in trade as administrators the forced relocation of native people to other areas. It's debated how much the Assyrians and Babylonians also required some recognition of their gods by the subject peoples. All the nations of the ancient Middle East had their own pantheon of gods and goddesses. They fought and conquered under the sponsorship and protection of their gods. Thus, for example, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib wrote up his military campaign in Syria and Palestine, he boasted in his inscriptions, quote, "The awe-inspiring splendor of the weapon of the god Ashur, my lord, overwhelmed my enemy's strong cities," unquote. Another Assyrian king, Sargon, had written, "I, Sargon, the mighty ruler, devoted to the pronouncements of the gods Nebo and Marduk, observing the orders of the god Ashur, led my army across the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers." If a king was thought to battle under the protection of his own high gods, then it also followed that victory signaled in fact the victory of his gods and the defeat of the enemy's gods. It was often the case that images or other cult items of the conquered god might be captured and taken home and placed in a sort of servant role, servant position in the shrine of the conquering deity. The dramatic thing about Cyrus is that he seemed to change this basic policy of empire governance that had been so well known under the Babylonians and the Assyrians. Cyrus's policy of administration seems generally to have allowed as much local identity as possible to remain intact among his subject people. Local kings were almost always eliminated, to be sure, and the captive regions were turned into Persian administrative districts governed by appointees of the Persian throne. And of course, always substantial taxes would be paid to the Persian crown. However, note these facts. Cyrus did not normally practice deportations. Local ethnicities and language groups were usually respected. Local religions were allowed to function and were not violated. They could be practiced, as long as the Persian government could be sure that they were being practiced according to standards that were officially on file, so to speak, and as long as they did not violate Persian law. Not only did Cyrus pursue a policy of maximum local toleration, he seems even to have identified himself publicly on some occasions as an instrument of those very local gods whose people he has conquered. And this is where the Cyrus Cylinder becomes of interest to us. Cyrus's royal propaganda picked up and elaborated two themes that had long been a part of the ideology of kingship in the ancient Middle East, but was not always observed. Kings often boasted, at least in rhetorical theory, that they were the gatherer of those who were homeless and scattered, and the kings often boasted that they restored gods and repaired their sanctuaries. As a Zoroastrian, Cyrus would have worshipped the deity Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda was assisted by various benevolent spirits and deities. Something in the worldview of this religion of Cyrus, along with his own shrewd political insights, encouraged Cyrus not to define himself as having crushed the gods of those that he conquered, but rather to have been assisted by those various gods. So, when he conquered Babylonia, Cyrus portrayed himself as the instrument of the Babylonian high god Marduk himself. This is a good point now, I think, to look at a translation of the Cyrus Cylinder. This inscription is broken. What you will see when you see the cylinder on display actually results from the piecing together of several sections that have been scattered. The opening of the cylinder is obviously rehearsing everything that Nabonidus, the Babylonian king, did wrong. Clearly, this inscription is intended especially for a Babylonian audience. It's not written in Cyrus's native language of Old Persian. It's written in Babylonian, in the cuneiform script of Babylon. So he starts off by talking about all the terrible things that the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, did. He knows that a lot of the Babylonian citizens will agree with him. Notice that in verse 11, he begins to talk about the fact that the high god of the Babylonians, Marduk, was himself becoming very unhappy with Nabonidus, and so Marduk himself chose Cyrus and called him by his name and proclaimed him aloud for the kingship over all of everything. Cyrus then does a rather astonishing boast here of claiming that it's not his own god, but the high god of the Babylonians who has commissioned him to go on this campaign and take over the governance of Babylonia. It is Marduk that ordered that he should go to Marduk's own people, Babylon, and Marduk walked by his side and protected him and guaranteed the effect of his fighting and brought the various people that he encountered to subject themselves to him. Down in verse 23, he talks about the joy of the gods at what he did, so that he was able to found his own sovereign residence within the palace and the celebration and the rejoicing in Babylon. And Marduk, the great god, bestowed on me as my destiny, the great magnanimity of someone who loves Babylon. So that there really wasn't much fighting, but that I, Cyrus, was able to go into Babylon more or less peaceably without having to do much actual warfare. Now, it gets more interesting and more pertinent to us. Marduk pronounced a sweet blessing over me, and then he begins to describe what he does once he's in this new position of power. I took the gods, the many gods who the Babylonians had taken from their native places and deported them to Babylon, and I made new sanctuaries for them, and I collected them together to their people and returned them to their native places, to their settlements. Furthermore, I returned them unharmed in their cells into the sanctuaries where they were happily to exist. and I even provided sacrifices to these various deities. Furthermore, he says in here, I removed people who had been displaced back to their native places. In verses 33 and 34, I collected together the people and returned them to their settlements. So the heart of the Cyrus Cylinder inscription is Cyrus's affirmation that, number one, he has been the choice of the very gods of the Babylonians themselves to be the one to take over and rule Babylon. And number two, that his philosophy of government enacted here is that he has allowed the native gods to return to their places, and he has allowed the deported people to go back and live in their homelands. Now, notice that in this list, these names may not be familiar to you, but if you look at the locations here, Shnuna, Zomban, Naturna, Dir, Guti, these are not places in Syria, Palestine. These are places west of the Tigris River, in other words, on the outskirts of Mesopotamia itself. So this is a message recording the return of people who had been captured, but not people who had been captured in Syria, Palestine. There is no mention here of the Jews or other people in Syria, Palestine. This inscription, which may have been drawn up fairly soon after Cyrus actually captured Babylon in 539, reflects then both a religious inclusiveness and an administrative policy of tolerance that contrasts dramatically with what was generally known under previous regimes. Cyrus's philosophy seemed to be that the more content a conquered people can feel, the more whole and less fractured they can see themselves as being, the less likely they will be to revolt or cause trouble. His theology also did not require Cyrus to enact the idea that his own deity had conquered the deities of the subject people. Rather, he identifies with at least some of these gods and tries to see himself, or at least to portray himself, as actually the servant of these other gods. Here in this inscription, Cyrus presents the idea that his victory has been due to the will of the Babylonian god Marduk, rather than his own god. Now we have to be careful here. This, folks, is raw political propaganda. These inscriptions were written to aggrandize and undergird Cyrus's political status. Cyrus was a shrewd, ambitious empire builder, not a modern Western social liberal worshiping at the shrine of diversity. Nevertheless, his dramatic change in administrative policy had hugely beneficial consequences for thousands of ordinary people in that time, not least for the Jews. This, then, is a logical place for us to turn to the two primary locations in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament where Cyrus is talked about. Cyrus is talked about in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is really one book in the Jewish tradition, the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and he's also talked about in 2 chapters in 2nd Isaiah. The apocryphal book 2nd Esdras also has narrative about Cyrus, but that largely depends on the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and so I'm not going to talk about that tonight. Let's look at the Ezra text. The writer of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah probably wrote his book sometime in the 300s BCE. He remembers a decisive change that occurred for the Jewish people almost immediately after Cyrus captured Babylon. Look at the text. In the first year of the king of King Cyrus of Persia, in order that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia so that he sent a herald throughout all his kingdom, and also in a written edict declared, quote, "Thus says King Cyrus, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem and Judah. Any of those among you who are of his people, may their God be with them, are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and Judah and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel, He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Let all survivors in whatever place they reside be assisted by the people of their place with silver and gold and goods and animals, besides freewill offerings for the house of God in Jerusalem. This is referred to again in Ezra chapter 5, verses 5:11 to 6:12, where there is an allusion to King Cyrus in the first year of his reign, making a decree, saying, moreover, the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which had been captured out of the temple in Jerusalem and brought into the temple of Babylon, and King Cyrus took out of the temple, and they were delivered to a man named Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. He said to him, take these vessels, go and put them in the temple in Jerusalem. And then this is repeated one more time in Ezra, farther down in Ezra chapter 6, where there is some more specific information about the throne providing equipment for the Jerusalem temple. Now, what these texts are claiming is that already in the first year of Cyrus's reign, this would be 538, he granted those who had been forcibly relocated from Jerusalem by the Babylonians and who had been living now for half a century, mostly in the neighborhood of Nippur in Babylonia, give them the right to return to their homeland in Judah. Now, what had once been the nation-state of Israel, of course, no longer existed. A large section of what had once been the country of Judah around Jerusalem was now renamed Yehud, and it was incorporated into the Persian administrative district called the land beyond the river, Aber Nahara. This map, which didn't reproduce very well, shows you the land of Yehud right here. Here's the Dead Sea, and this is the administrative district under the Persians to which these restoration efforts were directed. Nevertheless, legally, the deportation of the Jews was over. They were allowed to return home. Furthermore, according to Ezra Nehemiah, royal permission was now granted for the returnees to carry funds with them back from their exile communities. The third thing to be noted is that various objects that had been looted from the Temple of Jerusalem by the Babylonians were to be returned. This last feature is a bit puzzling. If precious metal objects had been stripped from the Jerusalem Temple back in 586 merely as spoils of war, it would be odd for them still to exist 50 years later as an intact collection. In the opinion of many historians, it is more likely that since there was no image of Yahweh, no statue such as other gods had, that could be captured by the Babylonians as a symbol of Yahweh's defeat, the Babylonians took the next best thing. They took an assortment of various sacred furnishings and implements from the Jerusalem temple. These might have been kept together in some location that would have had theological significance. They serve collectively as a kind of near equivalent to an image of Yahweh, and so they might well still have existed and thus have been returnable. Now, we want to be clear here. There are no records that survive outside of Scripture of this decree by Cyrus in 538 allowing the deported Jews to return and giving help to the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. But this conforms exactly to the policy that we do see attested in the Cyrus Cylinder for other groups in Mesopotamia who had been deported and victimized by the Babylonians. It is, of course, possible that the writer of Ezra Nehemiah is being a bit paraphrastic and is simply describing as an actual separate edict for the Jews what was really just an announcement of a policy decision. On the other hand, there is nothing that would make such an actual edict impossible. It is mentioned several times in Ezra Nehemiah, which was written during the Persian period. And when the persons of Ezra and Nehemiah themselves were opposed in their Jerusalem work under the later Persian king Darius, the tradition remembers that a written record of Cyrus's decree about the Jews was found in the royal archives at Ecbatana. and Ecbatana was indeed an important royal city of the Persians. When we look at the inscription in the Cyrus Cylinder, we cannot find the name Judah or Judahites or Yahweh or Israel. But we do see there the record of the actual policy that would have allowed the leadership classes of Judahite society to return to Jerusalem and reestablish a community centered on the renewed worship at the temple. Cyrus wrote in that inscription, you remember, "From Babylon I sent back to their places to the city of Asherin, Susa, Akkad, the city of Zamban, Meturnu, Der, all the sanctuaries by the Tigris whose shrines had earlier become dilapidated. I sent back the gods who lived there and made permanent sanctuaries for them. I collected together all their people and returned them to their settlements." That policy, which is documented in the Cyrus Cylinder, is the same policy which is cited in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah as the thing which allowed the Jewish returnees to come from Babylon back to Jerusalem. Somewhere else in a text that does not survive outside the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus may have written, "From Babylon I sent back to its place in Judah, to the sanctuary in Judah that had become dilapidated, their God, Yahweh. I collected together his people and returned them to their residence." It's only a guess, but it's a possibility. It is important for us to remember that despite Cyrus's decree allowing the Jews to return, only small groups ever did so, scattered over a period of decades. Some of those deportees never did go home, so that even well into the Common Era, Jewish settlements in what once was Babylonia remained major centers of Jewish culture and scholarship. But those who did return laid the basis for an important continuity of faith and culture centered around the Jerusalem temple. I mentioned that there are two main locations in the Hebrew Bible that talk about Cyrus. In addition to Ezra and Nehemiah, we must step back now several decades earlier to material that was probably written by an actual contemporary of Cyrus, the unnamed prophet who issued the material that is now found in chapters 40 to 55 of the book of Isaiah. We do not know his name, if he was one individual. He built his message by means of reflection and conversation with the preaching of Isaiah of Jerusalem, who had lived way back in the late 700s, and he was content to attach his preaching to that material and to remain anonymous. His preaching constitutes some of the most majestic and lyrical material in the Hebrew Bible, and it also stands theologically at a high point, as it sets forth powerfully the faith that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is the only divine being in all reality, the source of all that is, and that as he created everything, so he has unlimited power to rule the history of the whole world. Let's look briefly at chapters 40 to 55. The prophet here is clearly writing at about the same time as Cyrus's conquest of the Babylonian Empire. In the background to this material, thousands of his people are still hopelessly confined in their settlements in Babylonia. The integrity of the covenant people is still shattered as Nebuchadnezzar had vanquished them. They have no nation, no Davidic king, no functioning Jerusalem temple, thousands of scattered people in Babylonia and Egypt, no hope of reunion. Yahweh and his people remain apparently the permanent losers to the Babylonian gods. It is the wonderful mission of this prophet in Isaiah chapter 40 to 55 to announce that this terrible state has come to an end and that the God of Israel is about to set his people free and to recreate them as the nation. Comfort ye, my people, are the opening words in the King James Version of his chapter 40. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, and cry to her that she has served her term and that her penalty is paid. In the wilderness prepare the word of the Lord, he continues. and he announces a huge procession that's about to begin, led by Yahweh as king, that will be like a new Exodus. The first Exodus was out of bondage in Egypt. This new Exodus is going to be out of the bondage of Babylonia. Their God himself will lead it, and so they need to make ready the highway. Now in chapter 44 and 45, he begins to get quite specific about how this divine deliverance is coming about. And he mentions Cyrus by name. Thus says the Lord to his anointed one, to Cyrus, whose name I have called, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their robes, and to open doors before him, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, he shall carry out all my purpose. The prophet, of course, would not mention Cyrus here if Cyrus's name was not already known to a certain extent among his audience. Otherwise, his preaching would be meaningless. He's trying to convince his audience that God will indeed liberate them, and he says here that Cyrus will be the key instrument that God has chosen to use. This means that the political rise of Cyrus must already have begun. How much has Cyrus conquered so far? Has he actually taken Babylon itself? It is likely. It is inviting to think that the prophet's words here were uttered in 539. Perhaps he even knows the decree that's preserved in the Cyrus Cylinder. Remember those lines in the Cyrus Cylinder? He, that is Marduk, looked through all the countries, seeking for the upright king of his choice, and he took the hand of Cyrus, the king of the city of Anshan, and called him by his name, proclaiming him aloud for the kingship over all of everything. Notice how similar the lines are here from the Isaiah prophet. Cyrus, he is my shepherd. Shepherd is a standard metaphor for king in ancient Near Eastern language. Thus says Yahweh to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped. Cyrus is showing himself to be an incontestable conqueror. And the prophet is given to see that such power can only come from the one divine being who is Yahweh, the God of Israel, who creates and governs everything. If Cyrus is moving this way on the world stage, then it can only be Yahweh who empowers him. Cyrus, of course, does not know this. Notice that the text says, I call you by name, I surname you, though you do not know me. Cyrus does not know Yahweh, but ultimately it is so. Yahweh has chosen Cyrus as his instrument in the same way that Cyrus boasted that Marduk had chosen him as his instrument. To describe Cyrus as Yahweh's anointed one is to use the most politically intimate expression available in Hebrew for king. Anointed one, Messiah, Mashiach, refers to the ceremony of inauguration. And normally, if one would speak of Yahweh's anointed one would think of a Davidic king. Cyrus is connected to Yahweh's work in world history by our prophet as closely as if he had been a descendant of David himself, at least for this one intermediate period. Thus says Yahweh to his anointed one, to his Messiah, to Cyrus. But of course, this is not a carte blanche election. This is not an absolute divine imprimatur on all that Cyrus might do. Yahweh is choosing him for a specific purpose, to break the hegemony of Babylonia over the covenant people and to provide for their return and restoration in Judah. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel, my chosen one, I call you by name. It is for their sake that Cyrus is being used. In 45:13, I have aroused him, Cyrus, and I will make his path straight. He shall rebuild my city and set my exiles free. The text of 2nd Isaiah proceeds to reflect some doubt on the part of the prophet's audience. It would appear that the political power of the Babylonian Empire so far makes it difficult to believe the daring promise of deliverance that is being offered here. After all, for a long time, the Babylonian deities have seemed more powerful than Yahweh. To this, the prophet makes basically three responses. First of all, He ridicules the deity images that these exiles, these Jewish exiles, see every day in the Babylonian shrines and holy processions where they have been resettled. These are, after all, made by human artisans. They cannot move on their own. If you want to have a royal procession with one of these gods or goddesses, they have to be carried about. And once you set them down back in their place, they have to be bolted down so that they're not accidentally knocked over. How can anyone, the prophet asks, be so idiotic as to think that such things really are the source of power to shape international history? Secondly, the prophet asks them to compare such idols to the living God, Yahweh of Israel, who is the one who has created all things and the source of all that is. If God made it all, he can govern it all. I am the Lord, and there is no other. Chapter 45, verse 7. I form light and darkness. I make what is good and what is bad. Third, he asks them to look at the power of Cyrus. Look what Cyrus is doing. He is conquering nations and overthrowing kings. He's breaking through fortifications long defended. He's gaining control of international wealth of unimaginable extent. I am God, and there is no other. Chapter 46:11. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man for my purpose from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have planned, and I will do it. Cyrus shall rebuild my city and set my exiles free. Unquote. Actually, when one looks at chapter 47, it appears that our prophet expected that Cyrus's defeat of the Babylonians was going to involve pretty large-scale, terrible destruction. That, of course, did not come about. Babylon fell to Cyrus without too much struggle and apparently without too much violence. Nevertheless, this was a reflex of the prophet's vision that Cyrus would end up being absolutely victorious over the Babylonians. Obviously, the prophet of 2nd Isaiah has to know more than simply that Cyrus is an unstoppable conqueror building a new empire on the bones of the old one. He also has to have a reason to expect that after this conquest of Babylonia, it will be his policy to let the Judahite exiles go from their resettlement communities back to Yehud. How does he know that? If he's not actually seen the Cyrus Cylinder or heard such decrees, he at least will have had some kind of report about Cyrus's general policy, this captive people. It is then not his prediction of deliverance that is 2nd Isaiah's only striking contribution. Rather, it is his understanding that regardless of what immediate historical causes seem to be in play at the level of human realpolitik, ultimately, it is the hand of the only God, Yahweh, who is at work in the rise of Cyrus and the creation of Cyrus's administrative policies. Thus it turns out that the political program of a Persian ruler set forth in this inscription that you can soon look at in person is nothing less than a key instrument by which the biblical story of salvation and its interpretation has been carried forward. Cyrus obviously knew nothing of Yahweh, had absolutely no investment in the population of ancient Judah. He died not too many years later, about 530. But his empire building and the very tolerant administrative policy that he adopted for a variety of reasons turned out to be key factors in there being once again a Jerusalem and a Jerusalem temple populated by persons who would keep alive the sacred traditions of Yahweh and his saving promises to Abraham. That concludes the things that I had planned to present to you tonight. I hope this, when you look at the Cyrus Cylinder or have a chance to spend a lot of time on the website, will help you to understand how Cyrus had a connection with the biblical history. I'm glad now to try to address some questions that have come in. Let me, a number of you have written questions. Let me see if I can pull these up.
Bob, if you click on the question, it will bring up the full text in the bottom panel of the question.
Okay. I hope I'm on the first one. Here's the first question. Given that the Cyrus Cylinder does not mention the Jews of Syria-Palestine, is there evidence beyond the Jewish scriptures that Cyrus actually acknowledged the Jews as a separate people, or is it possible that he just considered them part of Babylon and the Jewish people claimed the Cyrus decree for their own freedom of worship? Very good question, and I did try to emphasize the fact that there's absolutely no specific reference to the Jews or the Jewish people. We have no way of knowing if Cyrus had any awareness of them as a distinctive people. There is nothing outside of the Cylinder and outside of the Hebrew Bible or related Jewish literature that refers to this. And so, as I've tried to say, it's certainly not implausible that there might have been something specific about the residents of Judah that allowed them to go home, but if so, we don't have it. We actually have very little literature that survives from these Persian rulers, these early Persian rulers. I do think it's unlikely that they would have automatically been included in those largely Mesopotamian names that are listed in the Cyrus Cylinder as being allowed to go home. I think those are very clear, they're well known, and they are specific to the Tigris Valley area for the most part. So at the very least, I think we would be talking about a kind of extrapolation of Cyrus's policy from them to the Jews. But we just don't know for sure. Next question. Did any other civilizations also write their own versions of the Cyrus decree that is anything comparable to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah? I do not know of any. I do not know of any. This is not so much about Cyrus and more for fun. Are there any pre-Babylonian exile texts in the Jewish scriptures that describe weather theophanies of Yahweh in the thunder and lightning, or is possible exposure to Enlil led to such writings? Pre-Babylonian exile text describing weather theophanies of Yahweh. I'm not sure I can answer that question off the top of my head. I'd have to. I mean, we certainly have weather phenomena connected with theophanies of Yahweh, but it'll take me a minute or two to try to sort them all chronologically and decide whether any of them are early. So I'm not able to handle that question. Sorry, it's an interesting question. Can you talk more about the purpose of the cylinder? Did it just stand there, or was there some sort of civic purpose? We want to make a distinction between the cylinder and the decree that it records. The cylinder itself is an inscription written, obviously by professional royal scribes, on this, the inscription written on this clay cylinder for the purpose of being buried in Babylon. Now, this genre of the city foundation text is a known genre in ancient Assyrian and Babylonian. We don't have anything quite like it in our own society. I guess we might relate it a little bit to something like the cornerstone, where we ceremonialize the laying of a cornerstone and think we're doing something historic and meaningful by putting certain objects in it. Be something along the lines of that, to be very general. But obviously the content of this text, disseminated in some other format, will have served Cyrus's political propaganda. Number one, he wants his Jewish population, he wants this Babylonian population that he's just conquered to be convinced that this is the will of their own gods for this Persian guy to come and rule over them. Furthermore, he does want them to see that his rule is known to be benevolent. He's not someone to smash and oppress and deny, but his basic strategy is to allow people to go home and to have the integrity of their own religion. So I would say, in general, the thrust of the decree was for the purpose of gaining him popularity and making the captive Babylonian population as receptive and cooperative as they might be. And that would extend to anybody else who heard about it. Is it possible that the Persians did not think the Jews were important enough to bother to mention them? We think the Jews were important, but Cyrus need not have. Well, the premise of the question is absolutely right. This is a tiny component group in a very, very large political hegemony. As I've said several times, there's no reason to necessarily think the Persian crown had any awareness of this tiny ethnic group in their own right. If there would be a reason to think that some special focus might have been given to these former residents of Jerusalem, it could be simply that Yehud, what had been Palestine, militarily could be important as a buffer zone because it lay directly in the path that Egypt would have to take if Egypt tried to militarily come up in the west and challenge the Persians. So it was always in the interest of any of the great empires to have a docile, if not to have a secure, if not a happy people in that district there in what had been Israel. That's one reason we could think of that perhaps this little people might have gotten some notice by the Persian crown, but it remains a guess. We don't know. Since the cylinder was written for the records of the Babylonians in their script, why mention anyone else? Yeah, I think you're just agreeing that it doesn't surprise us that the cylinder doesn't necessarily include other people. It's a way of, I take it that the questioner is sort of suggesting here through the side door that once in place, Cyrus's policy might well have extended to other people, and it wouldn't be a refutation of that to see these other people not mentioned in a text that was primarily designed for a Babylonian audience. Since it is not possible that Cyrus specifically freed the Israelites, did Isaiah possibly use his knowledge for a liberation story to leave with Israel as a faith story? It's certainly possible. It's certainly possible. I am struck by how elaborate is the rhetorical effort, let me say, of the prophet in these chapters in 2nd Isaiah to seem to be persuading his audience. If this is a done deal, and the prophet is primarily simply affirming God's liberation of his people by means of Cyrus, it seems to me he could have done this in a much more streamlined and direct fashion. Plow through these texts line by line, and you can see that the prophet alternates between his affirmations of the surety of what God's going to do in Cyrus, and at the same time his engagement with skeptical questions that are being anticipated on the part of his audience. That inclines me to think, we can't prove it, but that inclines me to think that this is a real set of prophetic announcements, whether written or oral, to people who have not yet experienced all of this. That it's just in the offing as he writes. Is there any chance that different cylinders were written for different groups and we simply haven't excavated them? Yes, arguments from silence are always very dangerous, especially in those areas of history where we don't have very much that survives. And you know, as we've said already, the Babylonian Empire was the great, huge component that Cyrus had taken over, and so it doesn't surprise us that a whole elaborate text is written just for them. And it's entirely possible that less publicized, less publicly ballyhooed policy statements were issued concerning other component people, and they just didn't merit this kind of record. Cyrus's concern for culture and religion and difference seems unusual. Is there larger context or movement or philosophy that explains Cyrus? How would you contrast this to the Roman Empire? I'm not competent to contrast it to the Roman Empire. What specialization I have in ancient Near Eastern studies ends at 63 BC when the Romans come in, and so I'm not the person to ask about that. It's an interesting question. And how do we explain Cyrus? That's the great intriguing question that that people continue to ask. He is a new departure. Now, I know even less about Zoroastrian religion than I know about the Roman Empire. But my understanding is that Zoroastrianism historically, from the beginning, although we don't know much about it early on, seems to be a very adaptive and accommodating religion, or it creates a very adaptive and accommodating worldview. I think that's also true even in modern times, and there are some small numbers of adherents even today. It is possible that Cyrus's religion contributed, therefore, to his openness to other deities. At the same time, I do not want to discount the plain political savvy that is involved in treating captive people as well as possible. This is not rocket science, right? And I think sheer political expediency and good insight into human nature could also be an explanation as to why this particular man was drawn to a policy of greater accommodation. We don't have time tonight to go into the very complicated later history of the Persians. The Persian Empire lasted until Alexander the Great swept over this area about 330. But let me say that the accommodation, the tolerance that Cyrus put in place did not always work. There were revolts, there were uprisings, and some of the later Achaemenid kings, some of his later successors, did not seem to have the same benevolent stance that he took. That's the last of the questions that I see. And we've been at this for an hour, so I think it remains just for me to thank you for your interest, thank you for your attention. I hope the things that we have surveyed tonight give you some additional insights and help you make some connections with this wonderful exhibit. And I do hope that you can see it somehow before it finishes in North America. And if not, that you can look at these things in the British Museum sometime. Good night.